Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking to author Thomas More, and Thomas is the author of the book Care of the Soul, The Re-Enchantment of Everyday Life, Dark Nights of the Soul, more recently Soul Therapy. But today, Thomas, we're talking about your book on Ficino and Neoplatonism. And this is what you said in another book where you had an essay. When I first came across the writings of Marsilio Ficino around 1972, I had no idea that this man would have such an influence on my life and work. So, firstly, welcome. And secondly, why did he have such an influence on your life and work?
I knew from the very beginning when I first encountered his thought, which was, by the way, one of these miracle moments, when I grabbed the book blindly off a shelf in a big library, having no idea what was there, opened it up and read the first page that opened. And there it was, a paragraph from Ficino, and also describing him. So I learned in that moment that he was an astrologer, a philosopher, a theologian, a translator, a priest, a follower of Plato, a Magus, someone who practices magic. And I thought, wow, these are things that I'm most interested in. I couldn't believe one person was doing all of this. And I had never heard of him. Now, my friend Hillman had mentioned him in one of his books, but I hadn't read it yet. I hadn't read that book yet. So I didn't really come across him through Hillman. I found it myself, and I thought one of the things I discovered was that his work had never been translated much into English, especially his major work on astrology. So I thought that would be a very good dissertation topic for me. If you can translate something from an old language, that's pretty good. And it was true that my faculty were quite impressed that I had got this document that hadn't been translated and was willing to write this long commentary on it. So I was fascinated by who he was, and I still am.
Polyglot is not a word I like very much because the glot doesn't sound very aesthetically pleasing, but he was a polyglot, wasn't he, really? I mean, he had his finger in many pies, if we could put it that way.
He did a lot of things. As I just said, he did all those things I mentioned. He was very, very bright, apparently, and well-educated, because he translated a tremendous amount of work. And it was not easy. It was philosophy of Plotinus, mainly. Now, Plotinus lived in the 3rd century AD and wrote about Plato and wrote about the soul. And Plotinus was also apparently implicated in various forms of magical ritual called theurgy that was related to Plotinus. I mean, that was Plotinus and related to Plato's work. And so that made Ficino, to me, quite impressive. I thought if he could do all that work, not only translate, but write commentaries on these old texts, that was very impressive. And then he played music. He was very interested in music, and he was quite sophisticated about music. And art, he was obviously knew what he was doing with art. Of course, he had a lot of very wonderful artists around him at the time in Florence in the late 15th century. So, yeah, he was a very impressive man.
And this, I think what I got from reading your book is that he's a priest, but at the same time, and they're going back to Plato and they're going back to Greece, aren't they, at the same time? But influenced by, Hermetic philosophy. And there's this, undercurrent of other influences that are there at the same time. It's kind of like that was informing a lot of what was going on. And what is the Hermetic?
What's that?
What is,
Tradition?
yeah, Hermetic philosophy, the Hermetic tradition. What do you think about that?
It comes from the legendary leader of alchemy and other dark arts.
Mm,
You know, Hermes Trismegistus. This is not Hermes, the god of the Greeks. This is Hermes thrice, they call him the thrice greatest, three times greatest, Trismegistus. And this was a legendary figure that many people thought was a historical figure. At the time, they thought he was historical. And so the word Hermetic comes from that, from him, from Hermes. And so it was really a movement, a magical movement that involved curses and blessings that were considered magical, and there were different certain words you could use and gestures, images that had magical power, and even you might say cult powers. And so this became quite influential at this time. And Ficino had access to some texts from the Greeks, but he didn't have a library or bookstores like we have.
mm.
You know, at this time,
They were
people who
hard
were
to
in,
get.
they were hard to get. I mean, really, at that time, people of wealth, like Cosimo de' Medici, who kind of supplied Ficino with his livelihood.
Mm,
Um, Cosimo would send people out to various countries and places and tell them to check out the libraries and see if there are any books that we haven't seen yet.
mm,
There's another story that's quite interesting where there was going to be a council of the Catholic Church to try to reconcile with what they call the Eastern Church, like the Russian and Greek Orthodox churches.
mm,
And so they met in an Italian town called Ferrara, and then they moved to Florence. And when they came from Greece, theologians came with them, which even happens today when these churches have their grand meetings, the theologians accompany them. And one of the famous theologians, his name was Plato, he came from Greece to Florence, and he brought his books with him,
mm,
books that Ficino had never seen before.
mm,
Cosimo saw them. Of course, he was one of these book hunters.
mm,
And Cosimo said, Ficino, stop whatever you're doing and translate these texts right away.
mm,
At least that's one story that's told of it.
mm,
And so according to that story, Ficino interrupted his work on Plotinus and translated what's called the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic body of works,
mm,
Corpus. And these, I have some of these volumes,
mm,
public, what I mean, translations, not
mm,
the originals.
mm,
And uh, they are full of curses. Many of them are curses, some are blessings, but they're just like very short sentences. If you need help with someone who wants your money, here is a curse that you can, these words. So it was it's funny that these texts, the Corpus Hermeticum,
mm.
of course, they had other things and also they had some theory in them, but they were great interest to Ficino because he was quite interested in the power of magic. He got it partly from Plotinus, and then he had his own interest in astrology and things like that.
One thing I got, trying to think of how to say this, but like many people, Care of the Soul was probably the first book I read of yours, and I liked it. But then when I found, and I missed, I think I said this last time we were speaking, I missed The Planets Within. But I like it as much, if not more in a way, because it goes back to some of these influences that, what are they? They're like hidden influences in the West, aren't they? And also, like maybe polytheism, I could see it through the Greek pantheon and the gods and goddesses, but astrology was something that hadn't been overly exposed to. But then to see maybe that polytheism through Mars and Venus and Sol and Luna is another way of regarding it. So it's kind of like, what I get from it is these hidden traditions that after, when the rational enlightenment we went strongly down that way, we kind of forgot about all these things, didn't we? We lost them.
We lost them. We lost them generally, yeah, we did. Or they became so occult that they were like, these societies that were very hidden and no one paid much attention to and thought they were a bunch of quacks, doing strange. Actually, even the actual practices were watered down. So that even today, when people think of astrology, their only exposure to it is what they read in magazines, or maybe they might see it on the internet somewhere, but it's not. The astrology you see today in popular sources is not very profound. It's very much based on key words related to the planets. I mean, some astrologers are much better. There's a lot of good astrologers around. I have gotten to know quite a few, and really excellent. But in fact, when I say that, I got to be careful. My very good friends are excellent astrologers. And what they do is they have a much deeper sense of what's going on. And they're very being able to read a chart. It's like a musician being able to read they can read it and then, translate the images into a very accurate and subtle analysis of a life.
And I think the other thing I got is that, with Care of the Soul and with Ficino and his Book of Life, kind of Care of the Soul was your, modern version of the Book of Life in a way, wasn't it? It's kind of like, and there's something about the approach to psychology, which is not about getting rid of things or eradicating things, but kind of learning how to build up more of a pleasure towards life. So sometimes I think when we think of the occult, we think of something dark, or whatever. Yes. But there's this aspect of, what is it? What I get from it is, with the magic, it's kind of like, it's actually how to through the soul, to build a life of pleasure.
So that magic is very much belongs to Care of the Soul. I mean, it belongs there. It's just that when I wrote Care of the Soul, I was writing primarily as a therapist.
Yeah.
That was what I was doing and what was impressing me so much, and how I could apply the ideas best. But when I'm not the therapist, I can see more the connection between the magic of this Renaissance magic and the soul, caring for the soul, of having power in the world to affect the soul. You can't do that through rational methods very well, but you can through magic.
So give us an example. What are some of the ways?
Well, one of the ways that it comes to my mind, I just was thinking about it for me as a therapist. One of the things I have been doing lately, especially, is sometimes when somebody presents me with a situation I found rather difficult to enter quickly, or a dream maybe, that I sometimes say things what comes to my mind. I do sort of what you might call automatic speaking, like automatic writing, which is a form of natural magic. And so I will just say things and I don't really know what I'm saying. And I find that it moves us along. It is And so that's a very simple example of in ordinary life. I think what you can do is not rely so much on your mind. We do that way too much. So
I
there
think
are
one of the things about being formally trained or scholarship is you can't really say anything unless you've got a reference. You know, it's a bit of a straitjacket in some ways, isn't it? It's like the intellect is constricted because the unconscious can't just kind of pop out and just, you know, express itself as it would want.
That's right. Now, for example, Ficino can be another example. For Ficino, one of the great magical things that he used was color. For him, color was very full of magic. So he would recommend to people that if you are depressed, to wear white or yellow. Or if you really want to deal with your depression, wear black, but that would mean going into it and kind of going through it. If you want to just have a nice day for a change, wear yellow or white. So for him, you see what I'm saying there? That's an example of how, if you want to live magically, color is a very important part of life. And so you don't ignore it. You pay close attention to what colors you wear, you use, that you use for anything that is important to you. The colors, that is one element of many, many elements in the practice.
And we were speaking a little before. I mean, when we say Ficino and the Neoplatonists, he wasn't the only one. There were other people around, weren't there? And you know, you were mentioning some of the people that you also liked from that time. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yes, of course. There were some people of his time that were also doing magic.
Yeah.
But what interesting to me, what happened, they were not so special. But the ones that came in later generations were interesting to me. For example, there was a man when he was 19, his name was Trithemius, and he was in Germany. And he read Ficino and was quite impressed by Ficino's work, especially his work on astrology. And when he was 19, he had a dream that he was going to be the abbot of a monastery. And he just so happened, shortly after that dream, walked past a big monastery, and he walked in and joined. And within 2 years, he was the abbot
Right.
of this monastery. And he practiced.
He was on the fast track to spiritual.
And but he was obviously quite brilliant, and he was very interested in being abbot. But he was also very interested in his learning and his practice of magic. So the story was that monks came to him and came in the front door of the monastery, and magicians came in the back door. People did not advertise their magic very much in those days. It was not a safe to do with the church so powerful. But for Trithemius was very interesting. He read Ficino, and out of that, he got interested in alphabets and words and letters. And he developed a practice of magic using words and letters. That was his thing. That was his main thing. And I think it's very interesting. I'm interested in that too as a writer. I do believe that there's a lot of magic in letters and in words. And if I can show you this is my book, Soul Therapy. Notice I think the colors here are very, very important. The yellow, the kind of a pale yellow and gray. And this particular lettering is not terribly interesting, but we worked on it anyway, trying to get the choice of font and lettering today on your computer can be a kind of magic. It's natural magic, remember, we're talking natural magic.
Yeah.
Just ordinary magic, everyday magic. And I think that people in advertising would say that if you can find the right font and the right color for the title of a book, you have a better selling it. People get up for that reason. They'll see that color and that will get to them. So or the image, whatever it is, will get them. That's a natural kind of magic, but it's very real.
Mm. Sometimes I think with Ficino that, you know, in the Greek pantheon, not a lot of people talk about Orpheus, but there was something a little bit Orphic about him, it seems to me too, that he actually played the lyre and you know, used music as a form of magic, didn't he?
You know, the music was developing very in a very sophisticated way. I'm talking classical music now mainly, although they have quite the distinction we have, but they did have some. But in his time, you know, thinking now he's there at the Duomo, Il Duomo there in Florence, this big cathedral, and some of the great musicians of Europe would come there and either perform or their music would be performed. We know that the music of Guillaume Dufay, who was one of the great composers of the time from Belgium, came and had his music performed at the cathedral there. And they had many theories about the relationship between music and life and the magical properties of music.
Mm.
It's even a theory, it's not accepted by most historians, but a theory that when the cathedral in Florence was dedicated, Dufay came and wrote a piece of music for the occasion, and he based it on the measurements of the cathedral, so that the actual, you know, angles and the distances, the lengths and all of that of the cathedral were then translated into the materials of the music. I won't go into that. You have to explain how that works, but it's pretty direct. It's not too obscure. And so this was going on when Ficino was there. You see, you've got music as magic right there, and he's surrounded by. Here he was a canon he was a priest at that cathedral, so he was hearing this music and maybe even encountering these musicians. So I think that it's not going too far to say that he was. It was an easy step for him to see the magical powers of music.
So it's how, you know, it's how to re-enchant life, isn't it? That's what it's about.
That's what
But
it's about.
but you know, in the I mean, drawing on astrology for a little while, it seems like there's contrary energies and contrary impulses. This is what I was thinking when I was reading through again, that Mars and Venus, you know, they're kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, aren't they? So how does one work with these contrary elements, impulses, energies?
That's a very interesting question. You know, it's one of the central ones of what we call archetypal psychology, which is a psychology based on images and the imagination primarily, mainly the work of James Hillman, but some of his friends working together developed it. And one of the essays that Hillman wrote, and it's in his book, Revisioning Psychology, the section of that book is called Psychological Polytheism. And what this means is that he said he looks at the Greek religion, polytheistic religion, and sees all these gods and goddesses, and the Romans picked that up too. They had a polytheistic religion as well. And in that religion, you honored every god and goddess, even though they be different from each other, and even contradictory. You had to find a way to honor all of them. And we have this written, it's plain sight in the plays from the Greeks, like Euripides' play Hippolytus begins with Aphrodite or Venus saying, this young man that this play is about is a fine young man, and he follows Artemis, this virginal goddess, but he doesn't like me, and because he's ignoring me, I'm going to punish him. So that's that polytheism. You better be polytheistic.
It's a mistake to worship only one God.
It's a huge mistake to worship only one God. So in the psychology, what we do is try to find a way not to not to come up with a rational solution to the contradictions that you see, but rather to find a way to expand yourself enough so that you can do it all yourself. You can actually honor all these different things, and you don't try to find a solution.
I think in my language, or maybe it's your language, is that the imagination becomes wide enough to hold. Like if the psyche is a boarding house, as I think Hillman once said, that there's kind of room for them all to live in the boarding house and have something to say.
That's right. That was Hillman's image. That's right. The boarding house. And, or you might say, as I indicated in The Planets Within, that there's an image of the peacock's tail.
Yeah.
Peacock having many colors in its tail, especially when it is sort of painted as a painting with a little more abstractly. You see all these colors, like
Yeah.
tail. And that would be an indication of being able to hold all of those different qualities. And you don't fuse them. You just hold them. You have a tail that has all the colors, but they're not resolved. They're still individual and separate.
Mm. Because it seems like gods go in and out of favor, don't they? Like Mars is a bit on the nose at the moment, maybe because we've seen so much of it. But you might say that sometimes you need a little bit of Mars.
Yes. Oh, yes. You need it every day.
So can you talk about that?
Well,
Because if I was a good, Californian New Age person, I might not respond to that very well. That, you need a bit of Mars every day.
Yeah, probably. Although most these days people are a little more sophisticated. Years ago, they would be like that. But today, I think I'm not saying they have a good understanding of it necessarily, but they know enough not to deny Mars, I think. But Mars is, to me, one way into that is that as a god, Mars, or as a planet, Mars is related to the color red. And it's that hot color, kind of anger can be seen as red, hot heat. And
Passion.
pardon?
Passion, maybe.
Yes, yes. And strength, having a weapon and being strong and daring. So the Mars spirit is all of those things. It's not just anger. It's not just violence. Violence would be kind of the extreme of Mars. Mars is able to be strong and tough and capable and confident and all these things. Mars gives a great deal. So you see, when you're looking at the astrology and you come to Mars, it depends. As an astrologer, you're an artist, Willie. You're looking at this chart and making sense of it yourself. So you have a great deal of latitude in each planet, how to refer to that. So Mars doesn't have to have that negativity of violence or anything like that. It can be confidence. That would be Mars. Decisiveness, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Okay, so you're kind of saying that this time, what was it, just over 500 years ago, the Renaissance in Italy, the Neoplatonism in Italy was kind of like a precursor of archetypal psychology, or is that what you're saying?
I think Ficino was a precursor, but I think Ficino's combination of Neoplatonism and magic was special. I don't get a whole lot of Neoplatonism in archetypal psychology. It's there. Hillman was very interested in it, but I don't think it's as strong as the combination of magic and Neoplatonism and Ficino. He is much more of a precursor of archetypal psychology. maybe than Plotinus, although I hesitate even to say that. Some people, there's a man I know called Gregory Shaw, who has written about Theology and Neoplatonism. That is a kind of magic that was practiced by the Neoplatonists. That would be closer to archetypal psychology. And of course, the Neoplatonists were interested in the soul primarily, and beauty. Beauty, when you read Plotinus, it's all about beauty and the soul.
Mm.
He says that every soul is an Aphrodite.
Mm.
Every soul has that Aphroditic quality. And so this is maybe jumping a bit, but I was just in London last Christmas. And I just spent a few days on the way to Ireland there. And I went to see the painting of Botticelli called Mars and Venus, which I've seen many times. I go there frequently. It's like a little pilgrimage of mine to go to the National Gallery where that painting is. It's not a terrible painting, but it's an important one. And it shows Venus lying together, just having made love, and Mars pretty much overcome. He doesn't have his strength anymore. And I think that's a very, very important painting about how we could deal with Mars when he's out of control through Venus. I think that's what Botticelli is proposing there, that Venus, as powerful as Mars is, the powers of Venus are stronger.
Yeah, so Venus. I mean, I think also there's this tendency when you talk about, you might use the words pleasure, deep pleasure, but it can sometimes seem a little like, people might think of hedonism, don't they? But I think this is where the soul's so important, the soul in the middle that mediates between.
Yeah.
But I suppose what I'm trying to get at too is we live in a time, the zeitgeist now might be kind of like social justice or social action or taking action, you know. And pleasure and beauty can seem maybe for some, not as immediate, or it could seem like just a hedonism. So I mean, how would you respond to all of that?
I consider myself an Epicurean,
Yeah.
follower of Epicurus, and Ficino did too, although it's said that the historians say that he gave it up, he disclaimed it later on, but I think he was under great pressure. Great pressure. It's thought there's a book written that's Pico, his friend Pico was probably poisoned by the Pope,
Right.
which is really, there were difficult moments there. You had to be careful what you wrote and said.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's what happened, but that's a possibility. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher before the time of Christ who lived in Athens, who taught in what they said he taught in a garden in Athens. And he said that pleasure is the most important principle in life, most important thing. But he did not mean hedonism. That's something. And his idea of pleasure was very modest. He recommended very modest eating, for example, but to enjoy eating, but modest. And he was a vegetarian, and he suggested to eat moderately, but to have great pleasure and have your friends around, to dine rather than to overeat. So his name has become associated with overeating, which is just the opposite of what he taught.
Which is a caricature of the whole thing in a way.
Caricature of the whole thing. So, see, I also think if this helps, I think Jesus was an Epicurean for sure. If you read the Jesus of the Gospels, he has all the signs of an Epicurean. He's always eating, dining, not and enjoying the dining. There's one story where this woman comes and anoints his feet with oil. That's quite Epicurean. Friendship itself is what Epicurus said, that friendship is the most important pleasure of all. And Jesus is always with his friends and concerned for his friends. It's so clear and so obvious that he does that. And he loves people. I think basically he has that approach to life that is about living simply, but with pleasure and moderately.
Mm.
All around Jesus is a good example of the Epicurean. There's a book written about Jesus and food, just about
Right.
the associations with food and Jesus. There are lots of them,
Mm.
and many in the Gospels. So I think that might help people to see that you can be a Jesus type and be Epicurean, that it doesn't have to be excessive or hedonistic at all.
Mm. And there's something about what Jung said, that if there's transformation, if one, intuitively for me, if one can enchant one's life and one's circle of friendships or whatever, that somehow it does spread out. It kind of reaches out further. That there's some principle in that.
Yes. I think that it boils down to this idea of soul. It's an important word for Ficino, for example. He thought it was very important to bring soul to his town of Florence, and to people's lives. And if you do that, it's going to be a radical kind of life. It's not a simple addition to your life. It's a radical choice to live from this deeper place that's not so rational, and where you live as a miracle worker. I wrote a piece, published an article a couple of years ago now, in a book edited by Murray Stein, the Jungian in Zurich. I wrote a piece on Jung, saying that Jung was not really a psychologist; he was a magician.
Mm.
Because I think that Jung's psychology is not nearly as interesting or as important as the things he did in his life, like learning how to carve stone.
Mm.
He took some stone carving, and from then on, he kept carving stone all over the place, all over his house.
Mm.
And he has the Bollingen stone, this block of stone that he carved various languages into and images. And that's the work of a Magus, trying to put letters, like Trithemius putting letters in your environment to have magical properties, to have them there so that you encounter them every day and you are affected by them. So see what he was doing. He was carving special alphabets in the stone. Jung, he was following the tradition of Trithemius. And then he did other things. He made books, that's what William Morris did. He made books to be powerful, potent, and he painted images in the books, like the Red Book. So he did the Red Book is a perfect example of Jung, the magician, making it to an object of power rather than words that express ideas. In this case, it wasn't about ideas, it was the book. It was the letters, the colors, and everything in the book.
So what's wrong with intellectualism? Is it just that it's missing some of this, some of what you've just been talking about?
That's a very good question. I've been thinking about that one. I think that there are great, obviously there are great advantages of being able to conceptualize the world in which you live. But the fact is, we take in the world through our senses and all the time. And we interpret our world through the senses, how we feel about something, how our body reacts to where we are and what's going on. we're learning things. We are, so much is coming through our senses. And if we translate those experiences into ideas, what we've done is we have reduced the experience maybe too much. One of the big questions in all of this is how far can we reduce? How far can we reduce an experience to an idea? How far can you reduce a dream to an interpretation? How far can you take a piece of art and reduce it to a theory? We lose a great deal in the process. We gain something because we notice things that we wouldn't notice otherwise. But we do that at a cost. We pay a price for that. And there's always a reduction. And you have to figure out how much you want to reduce. Personally, that margin has gotten smaller for me as the years go on. I want to reduce less, and I want to try to convey what I experience more fully.
Analysis from a far off distance sometimes. And then sometimes when you look at certain friends you have, just the way they're moved by music, there's more kind of soul in that, isn't there? That's just that people have this subplot running where they can be doing that far off analysis or that intellectual analysis. And then when they hear a piece of music, they're just fully invested.
Go bodily to it, or they may even move with it.
Like Elvis, he moved. He moved with
it. I guess the question is, what's going on in that movement? There's something important to the soul going on in that movement that doesn't reach the mind very well.
So I guess the question is, well, just before we get on to the last bit maybe, is what about some of these people from the UK that were kind of, I don't know, do you call them Neoplatonists? The Robert Flood and William Morris and...
Oh, no, I don't think we'd call them, I think we'd call them, the word I use is, I use the Latin form of the word Magus, which means like the Magi that came to the Christmas time. That was they were apparently astrologers in the story, but they might have been just a Magus, and astrology could have been one of their practices, if, assuming that they actually existed historically. So I would say that I would not call those people Neoplatonists. I would call them, although there is some of it in them, I would call them more that they were magi, they were maguses, if there's such a word. I like that word, maguses, myself, because I like magus as a description of who they are. They practice their own form. What it is, it's a form that tries to accomplish things that are quite ordinary and part of ordinary daily life, but you do it like with shortcuts and with extra power and powers that are not so obvious. For example, Trithemius said he was able, when he wrote a letter to a friend in a far-off country, he could write the letter in such a way that when his friend got the letter, he didn't have to read it. He just got the letter and he knew what Trithemius was telling him. So that's not quite so natural magic, I guess. It's kind of spooky, but it's a form of magic that's just part of daily life.
So apart from in Italy that this was happening, there was a bit of quite a few people in the UK, wasn't there? And it's been like that undercurrent maybe of activity, but also in the UK and Ireland.
A lot of them, yes. So in the UK, there was Robert Flood, who was an alchemist, and also he made quite a good money on being an alchemist. And he wrote a book called I forget the full title. It's something like, I've only seen it in Latin. It's on the macrocosm and the microcosm. So he was interested then in the relation between the universe and the human being, how the two connect. And that's what his magic was about, how to get the power of the universe in the hands of a human being. And what he did, he made various charts showing how the universe is made. And those charts are, to me, are fascinating and very, very useful, of 3 layers of experience: the angelic or the spiritual, the soul level, and the physical level.
Mm.
I think that's a very good way of body, soul, and spirit. That's a very good way of looking at who we are.
Well, Thomas, what if we go to the present time now? What can we learn from all of this for now? And considering that there's not many people that don't love the Renaissance, is there? The flourishing, the rebirth. But it was a precarious time as well. There was kind of death and rebirth happening at the same time. But what would you say that we could learn from that time for now?
I don't think the average person is aware of how much interesting occult things were going on at the time. We look at a statue of David, or like a great church, a cathedral, and we think, oh, how wonderful these artists were to make things that look beautiful. But there was a lot of undercurrent there. There was a lot of occult stuff going on. For example, there was a church in Florence, San Miniato, that it's up on a hill above Florence. And when you go in there, there's been a wonderful book written about that church. And there's a zodiac in the pavement of the church, on the floor. A zodiac in a Christian church, in a Catholic church.
Mm.
The main church is in a beautiful, magnificent church. But the zodiac is there. That's really interesting, because that's like saying the Hermetic philosophy had entered there, that whoever created that church was a follower of Hermes Trismegistus too, because that would be a sign of Hermes and the Hermetic philosophy. If you go to Siena, in the pavement at the cathedral in Siena, there are many images. Large, they're long. I forget, I'm trying to remember how long they are. They must be like 8 by 4 or something like that. I know, of course, I'm using my own American thing, but I know meter probably would be, I would say, 3 meters maybe long and 2 wide, and they're large. And there's one in the floor of the cathedral there of Hermes Trismegistus.
Mm.
The one that is usually used to show who he is when you look at books and they have pictures of him. That's the one that's in the cathedral in Siena. That's another interesting thing, that this Hermetic way found its way even into the churches.
Mm.
And of course, there's a parallel, because there's a lot of magic in religion, although religions don't like to admit it, but there is a lot of magic. And so it's very close, really, to the Hermetic way. But no, I can't remember how we got onto this, but Ficino and the Hermeticism is there in the culture. And at that time, it was like an occult presence. It wasn't one that was favored by the authorities, but it was there. And what I'm saying to you now is that it found its way into the very churches and cathedrals.
So what does that mean? You know, are we healing the split between, I don't know, sometimes I think, you know, when you think of the spirit, it can sometimes be a bit strict, or people get a little bit gripped by it, or it can be a little bit ascetic. And that somehow with polytheism and paganism and all that, that there's kind of this more multitudinal acceptance or something like that, where there's not such a, it's more, the soul is more, you lose some of that grip of the spirit.
Totally. That's the advantage of having an idea that the soul and the spirit are distinct, They're different.
Mm.
They're very related. They're both of equal value, great value. They both have their problems. And and they need each other. One without the other is usually inadequate and shows signs of deterioration. So if you don't have if like, let's say the person can be very spiritual and so spiritual that they live a very unhappy life because they deny themselves so much because the soul is there with its Epicureanism,
Yeah.
enjoying pleasure. And so that the two, if you're going to be spiritual, you should also be Epicurean and soulful. I was in a religious order when I was a young man.
Were you ascetic? Were you ascetic at that time, or did you
No,
always have that Epicurean?
I always had this other. I always, and the community I was in, for the most part, I would say, for the most part, certainly, was Epicurean. That we were able to get up at 5 in the morning and meditate quietly in silence every day, and then meet throughout the day to chant the Psalms. At the same time, then we could have wonderful dinners, just wonderful food, and to really enjoy dining. And we would enjoy play, a lot of play, and a lot of humor. And we had a great deal. I learned the great pleasure of study when I was there. I learned how pleasurable it can be to study things, to read books and to study various things.
Mm.
And study a lot of different things, that kind of polytheism.
Mm.
So I was a musician. I was interested in art. I was a theologian. I did a lot of things. I was interested in a lot of different things.
Mm.
And so that life worked for me. And it was not ascetic, but it was a combination of soul and spirit.
Mm. And what was, in the Odyssey, it was called what's the word? But having many sides,
Polytropos.
Polytropos, that's it. So it's kind of like, it seems to me that's what in this environment, even, that to have those many sides, and that perhaps those what is it, where the irrational curiosity takes one to follow, to research, to study.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Just I think it's August 1st. There's a talk I gave for the Jung platform, which they have a series on guidance and inner guidance, that sort of thing. So that's very important to me as this part of this whole business here, is to follow whatever guides you. This is what Jung would call daimonic living. The daimon, who is that presence inside you who tells you especially where not to go, but can also guide you positively to urge you to go in certain directions in your life. I feel strongly I have had a very daimonic life.
Yeah.
I did not make intellectual choices. I went where my passion was.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good. Maybe that's a good place to finish, Thomas. And I want to thank you very much for sharing.
Well, thank you once again for a really wonderful conversation. How many people do you know you can sit down and talk about these things with?
Not too many in my near vicinity, anyway. I can tell you that much. Anyway, let me just